our founding fathers had some things in common. They were from typically a European ancestry. They understood their history, and they were trying to avoid bringing that history to this country. The world in which they lived was, you typically had a king, a court, which was a small group of people around the king, and then the great unwashed. That would be me and you probably. These people, they knew that for centuries in Europe, the kings had fought with kings, the king and pope had fought with that king, then that king and the pope had fought with this king, and it was just a non-ending warfare with each other, where the people were just used as pawns. Some historians have said, well, our founding fathers, they arranged a form of government in this country that would serve to preserve their power and their wealth. Well, let's think about that for a minute. At that time of our founding fathers, you had a king sitting on the throne in England, a king in Spain, a king in France, a king in Prussia, a czarina in Russia, an emperor in China, and a shogun in Japan. This was not a world that was really conducive to individual rights and limited government. So the idea that our founders somehow came up with this form of government because it would have some kind of self-interest or benefit to them personally, I think is a real stretch. What our founders did have in common, with maybe the possible exception of Mr. Hamilton again, is they knew their history well enough to know that what they wanted to do was create a system in this country where power was dispersed and could not be centralized. Because the greatest fear they shared was a centralization of power. Well, that got us off to a good start, and it went for about 135 years. And then we had another philosophy come on the scene, and that's called progressivism. This is a movement to progress or move beyond the political principles of the American founding. It's to vastly enlarge the scope of the national government with the purpose and ends of that government to be redefined every generation. The progressives were the first people to come out and openly attack the Declaration of Independence. They were the first people to come out and openly attack the Constitution. They openly attacked the Founding Fathers and are still doing that today. If there was a year in this country's history that I think was the demarcation point from the founders to the progressives, I think it was probably 1913. In 1913, you had a number of really nasty things happen. You had Woodrow Wilson go into office as the president. The 16th Amendment was ratified. That created the income tax, which allowed the federal government to have an independent source of funding. You had the 17th Amendment, the direct election of senators, which we're going to come back to a little bit later. And in that same year, you also had the Federal Reserve Bank being set up. So this was a blow. Every one of those was a blow to what our founders stood for. One of the central tenets of progressivism, which is kind of laughable today, is that due to historical progress, government is no longer a danger to the governed. A rather odd conclusion given the fact that in the 20th century, more than 100 million people were killed, not in wars, but by their own government. 100 million people in a century. And you can figure that one out for yourself. Add up Hitler, Stalin, Mao, Cambodia, I'm losing the guy's name right now, Pol Pot, and then just tons of other little dictators all over the world that to gain power and then to keep power, they had to purge their own populations. So I'm not sure we can say that the 20th century shows that government is no longer a danger to the governed. In fact, I think it would be fairly easy to make the argument that the 20th century was probably the most barbaric century in the history of the world. Declaration of Independence says they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. What the founders were doing here was they wanted to take rights out of the purview of government. Your rights come from your Creator, your rights come from nature's God, your rights come from nature, but your rights do not come from government, because they knew that was a fast road to hell. Woodrow Wilson, on the other hand, in a 1911 address to honor Thomas Jefferson, some honor, Woodrow Wilson wrote the following: "If you want to understand the real Declaration of Independence, do not repeat the preface." In other words, Wilson was saying, do not repeat that part of the Declaration that enshrines natural rights as a foundational premise of American government. Frank Goodnoy, another progressive writing in the early part of the 20th century, praised the political systems of Europe, where he explained, quote, "The rights which an individual possesses are conferred upon him not by his Creator, but rather by the society to which he belongs. What they are is to be determined by the legislative authority in view of the needs of that society." So, according to the progressives, you have no rights. You have no permanent rights. That's decided every generation for the good of society. And I'm not exactly sure how you cope or how you make plans in a society where every generation all the rules are changing. The economic system. In 1776, two very important things happened, both of which substantially changed the history of the world. One, of course, was the Declaration of Independence. The other was Adam Smith's publication of The Wealth of Nations. Now, Adam Smith is referred to as the father of free market economics. I think that is arguable, but his book was an important milestone in economic history. Several years ago, I attended a conference where a very well-known economist named Israel Kirzner was asked by a student to, as simply as he could, explain what a free market is. Israel Kirzner said it is two things. Every individual has equal access to the market, and there's an absence of privilege once you get there. Now, every General Assembly session, I go down to the General Assembly building, and I see all these businessmen there meeting with legislators. I see their lobbyists meeting with legislators. I see their trade associations meeting with legislators. Now, do you think those businessmen are there to make sure that everyone has equal access to the market and there's an absence of privilege once you get there? They're there to make damn sure that just the opposite occurs. What do we call that? We call that evil. Because they're screwing up the whole system. Now, a lot of people say they're pro-business, but there's a difference between being pro-business and pro-market. Being pro-business could mean that you've got your snout buried so deep in the public trough that you need a snorkel to breathe. That's not being free market. That's being maybe pro-your business. What we're interested in and what the founders were interested in was being pro-market, where everybody has an equal access to that market and to rise to their level that their aptitudes and their willingness to work would take them. Woodrow Wilson, though, again, in an essay that he wrote titled Socialism and Democracy, suggests that socialism stands for unfettered state power which trumps any notion of individual rights. It, quote, proposes that all idea of a limitation of public authority by individual rights be put out of view, unquote, and, quote, that no line can be drawn between private and public affairs which the state may not cross at will.
We're there.
Yeah. You know, the one thing you'd have to say about Wilson is he was plain spoken. Wilson explained that he found nothing wrong with socialism in principle, since it was merely the logical extension of genuine democratic theory. Socialism gives all power to the people to carry out their will through the exercise of governmental power, unlimited by any, quote, undemocratic idea like individual rights. He also wrote, in fundamental theory, socialism and democracy are almost, if not quite, one and the same. They both rest at bottom upon the absolute right of the community to determine its own destiny and that of its members. So you don't determine your own destiny, as our founders would have preferred. It's the society and members of the community that decide your destiny. Private property versus redistributive state. It's always kind of been odd to me that the people who believe in freedom oftentimes cannot articulate the importance of private property in keeping them free. Parents have no such handicap. Parents can always explain to you why private property has to be abolished. In fact, Karl Marx said, and this is a quote, "The theory of the communists may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property." Our founding fathers understood that private property is essential to personal freedom and liberty because private property enables an individual to gain independence and therefore freedom from the state by accumulating land and money and wealth. So your land and money and wealth is sort of a buffer between you and the government. It allows you to make choices that you can make to protect yourself. Property is a manifestation of a person's physical and intellectual labor, and to seize a person's personal property is to enslave him. If you don't have a right to your time, to your labor, and to your income, you're going to tell me you're free? That's laughable. John Adams, this is another quote. John Adams said, "The moment the idea is admitted into society that property is not as sacred as the laws of God, and that there is not a force of law and public justice to protect it, anarchy and tyranny commence." However, one of the hallmarks of progressivism is the concept of redistribution. The idea that your money and property are only yours if the government doesn't determine that there is a higher or better use for it. Now, several years ago, James Buchanan, the Nobel Prize winner in economics at George Mason University, was asked to speak to the Cato Institute in Washington on the 250th anniversary of James Madison's birth. Dr. Buchanan made the following comment. He said, "A free society cannot simultaneously exist with a redistributive state." So when Barack Obama is telling Joe the plumber, we got to spread it around, he's playing his hand of cards there. You know where he is on the political spectrum. You know that he's opposing a free society, because a free society cannot simultaneously exist with a redistributive state. Let's talk about property, and I'll give you an example here. We had in the last gubernatorial election a candidate who said, "If you elect me governor, I'm going to put 400,000 more acres off limits for development." Well, when that governor's Secretary of Natural Resources came to speak at a group I host in Richmond once a month, I asked him, "Can you provide me a list with all the property the state owns?" No. "Can you provide me a list of how much it's worth?" No. If you don't know what property you own, how do you know you need 400,000 more acres? But the problem here, and I'm not accusing the governor of anything, but this comes down to, do we want the property to be in the hands of the government? And every single year, they put more money in the budget to buy up more private property. There are states out west that 60 to 80% of the total land in the state belongs to one government or the other. You know, Glenn Beck one time, and I don't know whether this is true, I'm just repeating what I saw. Glenn Beck, it was a great moment. He put up a map that was shaded in of all the property the government owned. And then he put an overlay on top of that that was a map of where the resources in the United States were. And it was a perfect match. I don't think that's by accident. Moving on to property, rule of law. Has everybody seen the statue of what they call the Lady of Justice? She's always holding the scales in one hand, has a double-edged sword in the other hand, and she's always depicted blindfolded. Do you know what the blindfold is symbolic of? The blindfold means that no matter who you are, when you come before the bar of justice, the law is meted out equally. It's meted out the same. That doesn't appeal to a lot of people, because there are people in office that like the idea of, I would rather have a means of rewarding my friends and punishing my enemies. And gee, you know, based upon historical differences between sexes, races, religion, age groups, whatever, don't we really have to treat everybody differently to make them the same? Well, that should be foolishness on its face. That should just be foolishness on its face. But today we hear people talk about social justice. It's always been interesting to me that people who talk about social justice, you can never get any two of them to give you the same definition of what it is. And I think they prefer it that way. They prefer it to be flexible so that they can change it on the run when they need to. What we must remember about social justice is that it is not an add-on to the rule of law. Social justice is a replacement for the rule of law. Constitutionally limited government. James Madison said, every word of the Constitution decides a question between power and liberty. There are two important amendments in the Bill of Rights that people oftentimes do not talk about. The Ninth Amendment, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. So they're saying very plainly, we did not make any attempt to list all of your rights. We listed some of them. The 10th Amendment says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. What they're saying is if the power of government isn't listed right here, they don't have it. So we've got a constitution of unenumerated rights but enumerated powers. That has been flipped on its head in the last 200 years. Today, our government can virtually do anything it wants to do, and people, every single year, there are more laws passed, more regulations passed on us and on our property that, you know, I heard a guy I used to work with say the country started out to be a sea of liberty with islands of restrictions. And what today we have is islands of freedom in a sea of restrictions. That has to be undone. And it's not going to be easy to do. Who performs the role of sovereign? This is something that's kind of interesting. Harry Truman never went to college. He was a very well-educated man, though. He was an avid reader, really kind of a smart guy. But he made a big boo-boo. Harry Truman had a sign on his desk that said, "The buck stops here." That shows you that Harry Truman didn't understand our form of government. Under the English system, the people are sovereign on election day, and then for all intents and purposes, they cease to exist until the next election. Gordon Wood is probably the greatest living historian today on the founding era. And he wrote a book in 2006 called Revolutionary Characters. In that book he wrote this. He said, in England, unlike America, the people gave up their full sovereignty to the legislature. So they made the decision, we're not sovereign, the legislature is, as soon as they're sworn in. John Taylor, who Park mentioned earlier, not me, John Taylor of Caroline, wrote the following. Now, John Taylor was a contemporary of Madison and Jefferson. John Taylor wrote, in the English Constitution, the nation and the government is considered as one, whereas by ours, the nation and the government are considered as distinct. So the government cannot make the claim that anything we do is for the benefit of the people, because the government and the people are not the same thing under our system of government. John Taylor also wrote, all our governments are limited agencies of the people, and the electoral process that created them did not eclipse the continued existence of the sovereign people. So ultimately the buck stops with us, and that in itself is a double-edged sword, because ultimately the problems we have in this country today comes down to being our responsibility. Either we or previous generations let it happen, and it's not going to be people in elected office that provide the solutions. It's going to be us telling the people in elected office what their agenda is. Form of government. Webster's dictionary defines a republic as a state in which the supreme power rests in all the citizens entitled to vote and is exercised by representatives elected by them and responsible to them. However, this is in the context of a system in which it is acknowledged the people have rights, and those rights cannot be tampered with, and the government has powers, and those powers are limited. That's a republic. Woodrow Wilson did not like to talk about republics. Woodrow Wilson liked to talk about democracy. Woodrow Wilson wrote, democracy is bound... Now, I love this sentence. This sentence, you know Woodrow Wilson is an intellectual because he cannot write a sentence. Democracy is bound by no principle of its own nature to say itself nay as to the exercise of any power. Now, he probably thought that was real good. But he says that democracy is not bound to limit itself in any way. Walter Williams, the economist at George Mason University that takes over for Rush Limbaugh every so often, he defines democracy this way. He says, democracy is two wolves and a sheep voting on what to have for lunch. And oftentimes we play the role of sheep. Purpose of government. The Declaration of Independence makes that one pretty clear too. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Say anything about health care? Say anything about public education? Say anything about Social Security? Food stamps? Transportation? What does it say the purpose of government is? To protect your rights. Period. The progressives, though, thought that the purpose of government is to respond to the felt needs of each succeeding generation. Principle of government. Now, this is one of the places where our founders thought that they had really achieved something. And truth be known, it failed. But it failed simply because people decided not to observe what they had put in place. I told you that the greatest fear our founders had was a centralization of power. What they attempted to do was divide power vertically and horizontally so that nobody could get too much of it. The vertical separation of power is called federalism. It's where different powers are allocated to different layers of government, whether it's municipal, state, or federal. As was pointed out in the quiz earlier, 17th Amendment to the Constitution. Originally, the House of Representatives in Congress was to represent the people. The Senate was to represent the states. This was an effort to make sure that the states were always there to counterbalance the federal government. And to use a word that has been used in history, to interpose between the federal government and the people. The ideal model for Wilson was the parliamentary system, and he said this. Wilson liked the parliamentary system because in that system, the executive and the legislature are essentially united. So, vertical separation of powers, federal, state, local. The horizontal separation of powers, is called separation of powers. Here what the founders did was they set up a national government that had an executive, a legislative, and a judiciary. So what they were trying to do here was to disperse power between different layers of government and disperse power across different bodies of government within the same layer. What's the word I'm looking for? Branches of government. Branches. And once again, this has gone awry. Because the judiciary, I think, has largely failed in its responsibility. I think some of that can be traced back to FDR threatening to pack the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court kind of folded like a cheap tent. But the founders' intent here did not work out the way they intended it to work out. And that can be kind of understood when you have people who are saying that I believe in a living constitution. Well, what they're saying when they say they believe in a living constitution is, I'm not going to observe the written constitution. A couple of years back, I went to a Christmas dinner in Washington, D.C., where the speaker was Justice Clarence Thomas. And he only spoke for a few minutes, and then he wanted to just answer questions. And everybody got to write down questions, and you sent them up front, and they picked the questions they wanted to ask him. My question, which was fortunately one of the ones that was picked, was, I said, does the idea of a living constitution negate the purpose of having a written constitution? And Justice Thomas said, you're either trying to apply the text as it was written, or you're making it up as you go along. I thought that was pretty simply put. I was surprised all evening at how politically incorrect Justice Thomas is, but it's a lifetime appointment, so he can pretty much say anything he pleases. Let me see here. Wilson and the Progressives on the separation of powers. For Wilson and the Progressive, the separation of powers had come out of the founders' obsessive fear of majority tyranny, and thus they thought the system was outdated for the present age, where the government no longer represented a danger to the people. Well, we've already talked about that one and how many people lost their lives in the last century due to their own government. Orthodox religion versus social gospel. Now let me say right up front, I'm not here to proselytize anyone. I don't care what you believe. But why were the progressives in the 20th century, early part of the 20th century, attacking religion? Today, religious people get attacked, and it's usually because they are opposed to abortion or they're opposed to same-sex marriage. Those were not front-burner issues in the early part of the 20th century. So why did progressives think they had to take out religion? Well, the answer is because they cannot afford for anyone to have divided loyalties. You know, if it comes down to you being loyal to your God or loyal to your government, the progressives have an answer for that one, and God loses. The social gospel adherents considered it to be their mission to fulfill in this life the New Testament's call to bring about the perfect kingdom of God. Social gospel theologians asserted the government was now in a position to bring about an earthly utopia in the form of the modern democratic state. Walter Rauschenbusch cited unorthodox religion. He criticized Orthodox religion for being too individualized. He thought that Christians should focus on salvation in this life by concentrating on social goods achieved through the state. Rauschenbusch explained that man would be judged not on the basis of his sin, but by the degree to which he merged his will with the divine purposes of the kingdom of God on earth. This meant overcoming man's attachment to things like private property and removing private property rights as an obstacle to social action. Quote, "We shall have to re-socialize property," and by this he meant that property was to be made, quote, another quote, "made to serve the public good, either by the service its uses render to the public welfare or by the income it brings to the public treasury." So your property is just there for the benefit of the government and the public treasury. Great new religion there. Permanent values versus historical contingency. The founders' principles and values that they believed to be timeless influenced their thoughts on creating a just government given human nature. Progressive believed that the ends and scope of government were to be redefined with each generation based upon the needs of society. So you've got the founders who believed in permanent values versus the progressives who believe that those values have to change with the times. Let me go back just a minute. Point I wanted to make a minute ago. Living Constitution. I'm for a living Constitution. Anybody else for a living Constitution? I'm for a living Constitution because that's what the Founders gave us. The Founders gave us a Constitution that could be changed one of two ways. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to amend the Constitution. That's why it's only been amended 27 times in the last 200 and so many years. The progressives understand that they can change the Constitution. They also understand there's not enough popular support for their ideas to be able to amend the Constitution the way they would like to see it amended. So they're not willing to go through the two ways the Founders gave us to amend the Constitution. They would much rather have their judges amend it for us, where we don't have to be involved.